ever wondered why we value morning comforts, hot showers, and cups of coffee so much? What if I told you that everything you know about mornings is an illusion created by the modern world? Just a few centuries ago, waking up was not the beginning of a new day, but the first battle for survival. It was a daily struggle against the cold, darkness, and a reality that left no room for weakness. Watch the video to the end to find out the true price of a simple sunrise in the Middle Ages. What if I told you that the alarm clock in the Middle Ages was not just dawn, but the icy breath of the room creeping under the thin blanket? For a medieval peasant, awakening began long before sunrise, in complete, impenetrable darkness. The first sensation was not the smell of coffee, but the pervasive cold. The temperature inside a simple hut made of sticks and clay was almost the same as outside. It was not the kind of cold we are used to. It was damp and penetrating. Frost covered the interior walls and even the straw mattress that served as a bed. The breath of the sleepers turned into thick vapor that settled on the coarse woolen blankets. Every movement was a challenge, as our joints had stiffened overnight. The bed itself was far from the modern idea of comfort. Most often it was a simple bag of coarse fabric stuffed with straw or dry leaves. This filling quickly absorbed moisture and odors, becoming hard and uncomfortable. It provided almost no protection from the icy floor, which was simply packed earth. Getting up from such a bed was not a desire, but a necessity. Remaining motionless meant freezing even more. There was no snooze button, no soft nightlight. There was only one solution: to start moving immediately to kickstart the survival process. The first few minutes were spent in complete disorientation. The only window in the hut was not made of glass, but was a small opening, tightly closed with a wooden shutter or a rag. Opening it meant letting in even more cold, so the first actions were taken by touch, in absolute darkness. All family members slept in one room, often on one large mattress, to keep each other warm. This provided minimal warmth, but also meant a complete lack of personal space. Waking up was a collective, abrupt, and silent affair, with one goal in mind: to light a fire. This daily shock therapy with cold weather formed a special kind of endurance. People were accustomed to discomfort from birth. Their bodies were hardened by constant struggle with the environment. What seems like extreme survival to us was just a normal morning for them. It was not a room, but an icy trap. I am very interested to hear your point of view. Which of these morning moments do you think would be the most difficult for a modern person? The darkness or the cold? Write about it in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Are you ready to learn the truth about what was more important than gold, crowns, and swords for a medieval peasant? That treasure was the smoldering coals in the hearth. For a simple man living in a hut with an earthen floor and a thatched roof, fire meant everything. Without it, there was no heat, no food, no light. The hearth was the true heart of the home, around which the life of the entire family revolved. Each morning began not with prayer or washing, but with the most important task: waking the fire, breathing life back into it, and making the flames live again. A peasant's hearth was extremely simple. It was a depression in the floor lined with stones, sometimes surrounded by a low clay rim to prevent the coals from scattering. There were no pipes, chimneys, or fireplaces, which would later appear in the homes of the nobility. The smoke rose straight up and escaped through a hole in the roof, which also served as a source of light. More often than not, it simply swirled under the ceiling, filling the entire room and gradually finding its way out through cracks in the walls and roof. In such conditions, the air inside the izba was thick and heavy. Even with the doors open, the smoke could linger for hours, settling on the walls and staining the ceiling. However, the peasants were used to this. Despite its unpleasant smell and irritation to the eyes, the smoke also played a useful role. It repelled insects, dried the beams, and protected the wooden structures from rot. A house where the hearth was often lit lasted longer than one where cold reigned for weeks. To prevent the fire from going out overnight, it was treated with special reverence. Before going to bed, the mistress carefully covered the coals with a thick layer of ash. This allowed the internal heat and smoldering to be preserved until morning. When the family woke up, the coals were still smoldering under the ashes. All they had to do was rake through the ashes and find a single live ember, a tiny sun in the gray dust. This moment was almost sacred. If a spark was found, the day began with good luck. If the coals had gone out, the real struggle began. The master of the house would take a flint in his hands, a piece of hardened steel and flint, once found in a field or exchanged with a blacksmith. This process required experience and patience. With one hand, you had to hold the flint, with the other, strike it sharply with a striker, and at the same time catch the slightest spark. Often hands trembled from the cold, fingers did not obey, and sparks died out as soon as they touched the tinder. From that moment, the second part of the ritual began. Thin splinters, dry twigs, or straws, which had to be prepared in advance, were placed on the burning tinder. If even one of them was damp, the fire could go out. Therefore, the peasants always kept the chips in a warm place, under a bench or directly behind the stove. When the chips caught fire, thicker branches were added, then logs, and only when the fire crackled confidently could they breathe a sigh of relief. The house had come back to life. Fire was not just a source of heat. It represented life, protection, and hope. Losing it meant being on the brink of survival. In the cold winter, if the coals went out and it was impossible to light new ones, you had to go to your neighbors and ask them for a burning ember. This was considered a disgrace and spoke of an inability to run a household. But even this humiliating step was better than freezing at night. Sometimes the coals were carried in special clay pots so that they would not go out on the way. People walked through the snow, carefully covering the vessel with their hands, as if carrying a living creature. After all, fire was indeed alive. It had to be fed, protected, and maintained. In some villages, there was a belief that the hearth had a soul, and if it went out, the house would lose its luck. As soon as the flame flared up, it brought not only the long-awaited warmth, but also clouds of smoke. The whole hut was filled with acrid fumes that brought tears to the eyes. Children were taken closer to the floor, where the air was cleaner, and adults got used to the smoke from childhood. At first, it seemed easier to suffocate than to warm up. But soon the smoke dissipated, and a feeling of calmness set in. The smoke had its advantages. It gave the walls a special dark hue, creating a feeling of coziness. The ceiling beams became almost black, but that didn't scare anyone. The soot became part of the house, like a mark of the years lived there. Within these walls, everyone knew that there could be no warmth without smoke. The hearth was used not only for heating, but also for cooking. Pots were hung over it on chains, porridge and soups were cooked, and bread was baked directly on the coals. Every morning when the fire was rekindled, the hostess would put a pot of water on it, and the house would fill with the smell of smoke and food. It was the beginning of a new day, simple, difficult, but alive. Sometimes, to reduce the amount of smoke, people built hearths out of stone or brick. However, not everyone could afford this. In most houses, the hearth remained primitive, and a smoky morning was as familiar as the crowing of a rooster outside the window. Even when their eyes watered, no one complained. The main thing was that the flame burned, because without it, the house was dead. For peasants, fire was a real sacred thing. It lit up evening conversations, warmed them in the winter cold, helped dry clothes, and even protected them from evil spirits, as many believed. Sometimes, before going to bed, they would throw a twig or some grass into the embers with a prayer, believing that the smoke would protect the house from misfortune. Thus, fire became not only a physical, but also a spiritual protection for the family. Which part of this process seems most difficult to you? Searching for coals in the ashes or striking sparks in the cold? But even with a fire, the room remained plunged into darkness. Fire gave life, but not light in the usual sense. Ready to learn how medieval people coped with eternal night and why their light was almost as bad as darkness? I'm going to reveal a secret that will change your perception of the past. What if I told you that the fire in the hearth gave off almost no light? The flame was low and smoky, illuminating only a small circle directly in front of it. The corners of the hut remained in deep shadow, full of frightening shapes. To get even a little extra light, you had to open the wooden shutters, but that was a difficult decision. Through the small opening in the wall, not only did the gray dawn twilight rush in, but also a new batch of icy air. It was a constant dilemma, light or warmth. In most peasant households, candles were an unimaginable luxury. Wax candles cost a fortune and were used only in churches. Tallow candles made from animal fat were cheaper, but still too expensive for daily morning use. The real light source for the poor was a splinter. It was a simple long piece of dry wood that was inserted into a crack in the wall or a special metal holder. The splinter burned quickly, smoked heavily, and gave off very little light. It had to be constantly monitored. It burned out in a few minutes and had to be constantly replaced, moving it in the holder. A basin of water was always placed under the torch, as burning coals constantly fell from it, threatening to set fire to the straw floor or bedding. A more advanced option was oil lamps. These were simple clay or metal bowls filled with any available fat. A wick made of cloth or moss was dipped into the fat. Such a lamp burned longer than a torch, but it smoked unbearably and spread the smell of rancid fat. Light was a resource that was conserved just like food. It was not used just because. In the dim light of a torch or lamp, women would begin to prepare food and men would repair tools. Every photon counted. Imagine a world where morning does not automatically bring light, where, in order to simply see your hands, you had to perform a whole ritual. This eternal semi-darkness, mixed with smoke and soot, was an integral part of the morning routine. This dim, smelly light was the only alternative to complete darkness. The struggle for photons was as desperate as the struggle for calories. If you are also surprised at how valuable a simple ray of light was, like this video, and be sure to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss new videos about survival in the Middle Ages. Guess how much time and effort it took to accomplish a task that we now do with the turn of a tap? The quest for water was the next critical morning task. Without water, it was impossible to cook food or give water to livestock, which often spent the winter in an outbuilding or even in the hut itself. These thoughts alone were enough to get people out of bed and into the cold. Water was not a luxury, but a necessity of life. Those who got there first had more energy for other tasks. The source of water was either a well or the nearest river or stream. In summer, the path to them was a matter of habit, but in winter, it became a test of character. The path was covered with ice and frost. The snow blinded the eyes and the wind knocked people off their feet. To prevent falls, the ground was sprinkled with ash from the hearth or fine sawdust. Sometimes low snowbanks were built to carry buckets between them. If there was a communal village well nearby, it was the center of all winter life. Here, people learned the news, agreed on mutual assistance, and took turns clearing the path. The well was treated as a sacred place. The health of the entire community depended on its cleanliness. A roof was placed over the log structure to prevent snow from covering the opening. Each family had its own time slot so as not to crowd together in the cold. The well chain or rope would get covered in ice and freeze to your hands. Lifting a heavy wooden bucket required strength in the back and shoulders. Sometimes a simple pulley was attached so that two people could pull together and not tear their arms. The surface of the water was often covered with ice. They broke it with a heavy pole or an iron crowbar, which was kept at the well specifically for this purpose. If water was taken from a river, they first found a hole in the ice or made a new one. The old hole was cleared of ice, throwing the chunks onto the bank. The edges were slippery and treacherous, so a board or fir branches were placed underfoot. They took turns standing guard at the hole so that it would not freeze over by the next morning. In severe frost, the ice grew right before their eyes. Working by the river was dangerous, so men or teenagers with a strong grip were more often allowed to do it. The ice was checked with an ice pick before each step. They kept a rope on their belt so that a comrade could pull them out in case of trouble. They tied their clothes tighter so that the wet edges would not hit their legs. Water was carried in 2 heavy wooden buckets on a yoke. The yoke took some of the weight and helped maintain balance, but dozens of kilograms still pulled down and cut into the shoulders. They had to walk softly and evenly so as not to spill anything. To avoid falling, they prepared the path in advance. In the evening, they dug shallow tracks for their feet in the snow. Sometimes one person walked ahead with a hook, checking the ice and snow. By the time the water reached the house, it was icy and often cloudy. A thin crust of ice might already have formed on its surface. The liquid was left to settle in a tub so that the grains of sand would sink to the bottom. The top layer was poured into another vessel, trying not to disturb the silt. Only the cleanest layer was used for drinking. Most of the water was used for food and livestock. Soup and porridge were cooked in cauldrons, and water was heated for kneading dough. The animals were watered immediately after returning, before the troughs froze over. Warm water was reserved for the sick and children. There was not a drop to spare, either in winter or summer. Weak ale or beer was often chosen for drinking. The fermentation process made such a drink safer than raw water, especially river water. Ale was brewed at home in small barrels using malt and herbs. It was stored in a cool place and did not spoil as quickly. The drink was diluted with water for children to make it very light. In winter, the need for water increased due to snow and dirt on clothing. Mittens and leggings sometimes had to be rinsed so they would not rub the skin. Wet clothes were hung near the hearth, and the drops were collected in a separate bowl. Heat and moisture returned to the house slowly and with difficulty. Each bucket had a price in terms of time and effort. Water was stored in tubs, buckets, and jugs with lids. The vessels were covered to prevent ash from falling into them and insects from getting in. Wooden tubs were steamed from time to time to prevent the seams from coming apart. Drinking mugs were kept above the hearth, where it was warmer and drier. This way, the water froze less and remained clean on top for longer. To prevent the buckets from leaking, the hoops were tightened and lubricated. The cracks were caulked with resin-soaked tow. The wooden handles were wrapped with a belt to prevent frostbite on the palms. If a bucket cracked, it was not thrown away, but repaired again and again. Every serviceable bucket was treasured. Sometimes water was saved by melting clean snow for technical needs. Snow was collected from the top layer, away from the road and the barn. It was thrown into the boiler in small portions, so as not to smother the fire. Such water was suitable for washing clothes and dishes, but not for drinking. The smell of smoke penetrated any cleanliness. The road to the spring was cleared by joint efforts. Men knocked down the snow crust, women sprinkled ash, and children carried branches for the flooring. After a blizzard, the whole yard worked together. Otherwise, it would have been impossible to walk. Thus, winter taught harmony better than any words. Water united people like bread and fire. There were simple rules at the well in the village. Whoever came first drew water first, but always gave way to a person with a sick or small child. Arguing in the cold was considered a bad omen. Everyone who carried water for years had sore backs and shoulders. To protect themselves, they adjusted the yoke to their height and shoulder width. The edges of the yoke were smoothed and rubbed with grease to prevent chafing. The shoulder was wrapped in a woolen cloth. Even so, by evening the body ached and breathing became difficult. Sometimes water became a commodity. Those who lived closer to the well helped their neighbors from distant huts and received hay or help with the farm in return. In bad weather, the men took turns going to fetch water so that no one had to overexert themselves alone. If the sources froze over too quickly, the trips were increased. It was necessary to run several times to keep up with watering the livestock. Because of this, other tasks were postponed until noon. The house was run on a simple rule: water first, then everything else. Winter did not allow for any other order. In spring and autumn, the water became cloudier than usual. Melting streams carried sand, leaves, and clay into the wells. Then the water was allowed to settle longer, poured more often, and boiled if there was enough firewood. In summer, barrels were placed under the rainwater to save energy. But in winter, the rain did not help, and everything again came down to ice and snow. Sometimes the wells were cleaned by collective effort. They removed the silt with buckets, replaced rotten crowns, and added gravel to the bottom. The work was planned during the thaw, when there was less risk of the walls collapsing. After cleaning, the water became softer and lighter. People rejoiced at this, as if it were a good harvest. Children were taught to carry water from an early age. First, they were given light mugs, then small buckets. The child walked between the adults and memorized every bump on the path. This is how reliable helpers grew up for the next winter. Knowledge of the path and the rhythm of steps became part of their memory. Domestic animals also influenced the water routine. Cows and sheep required more liquid than chickens or pigs. On harsh days, the animals were watered twice so that they would not weaken. The water was heated to a light steam if there was something to heat it with. The health of the livestock meant milk and wool tomorrow. In the evenings, the water supply was replenished once more so that the night would pass without alarm. The vessels were placed closer to the heat so that they would not freeze. A separate bucket and hook were kept in case of fire. Fire and water always coexisted in a winter house. One gave life, the other preserved it. What do you think was more difficult, lifting an icy bucket from the well or carrying it without dropping it? But ice water was not only needed for cooking. In the next chapter, you will learn about medieval hygiene practices. The process of washing in a medieval peasant hut had little in common with a modern shower. For a peasant, it was not a pleasure, but a duty necessary only to finally wake up and wash away the traces of the night from his face. The house, filled with smoke from the hearth, left a layer of soot on the skin and the smell of burning on the hair. Therefore, the morning began not with fragrant soap and a soft towel, but with ice-cold water and rough cloth. Washing was more an act of survival than self-care. The water for this procedure was taken from a bucket brought in from outside. In winter, it was so cold that a thin crust of ice often formed on the surface. It was broken, scooped up with a wooden ladle, and poured into a small basin carved from wood or made of clay. Sometimes the basin was placed directly on the floor, near the hearth, to warm up a little while washing. But the water was not heated on purpose. No one had the right to waste firewood on such a luxury. Every splinter was valued because the warmth of the whole family depended on it. When a peasant leaned over the basin, steam rose from the water, not from the heat, but from the difference between the cold water and the person's breath. The first touch was like a blow. The cold burned the skin, making the heart beat faster. Hands instantly went numb, but it was impossible to stop. It was necessary to quickly wash your face, washing away the traces of sleep and soot that had stuck to the skin overnight. At such moments, people seemed to test themselves. If you could wash your face, it meant you were ready for work. Soap was a real rarity and was almost never used. In those days, it was made by hand from animal fat, ash, and lye. The result was a caustic, unpleasant-smelling lump that stung the skin and left it feeling dry. Therefore, peasants preferred to do without it. Sometimes women made primitive washing mixtures from ash and sand. Such a brush removed dirt but scratched the skin. Most often, they washed themselves with plain water, rubbing their faces vigorously with their palms until they began to burn. This washing was truly invigorating. The cold water took their breath away and gave them goosebumps. Some men deliberately doused themselves from head to toe, believing that it gave them strength. Women tried to do it quickly, especially in winter, when the water caused their hands to crack. After the procedure, their cheeks burned and their eyes watered, but their bodies felt invigorated and determined to face the new day. A regular piece of coarse linen fabric served as a towel. It was not soft. On the contrary, its roughness resembled sandpaper. Such a piece of fabric was used not only for washing, but also for wiping dishes or hands after work. It was rarely washed, as washing required a lot of water and effort. Over time, it turned gray from soot and ash, but the peasants did not attach any importance to this. It was not cleanliness that mattered, but habit. Brushing teeth as we understand it today did not exist at that time. However, people tried not to leave an unpleasant smell after eating. Sometimes they chewed sprigs of mint, juniper, or simply tree bark to freshen their breath. Some rubbed their teeth with ash, a rough but effective cleaning method. However, all this was done not daily, but as needed. In the morning, they usually limited themselves to rinsing their mouths with water from the same basin. Sometimes women took more care of their hygiene than men. They could wipe their faces with a cloth dipped in vinegar or herbal decoction if such things were available. This cleansed and whitened the skin, which quickly darkened in conditions of constant smoke and soot. For wealthy townswomen, this procedure could even become a beauty ritual, but in a peasant's hut, it remained a matter of necessity. For children, washing in the morning was a challenge. They had to be persuaded, joked with, and pushed toward the basin, because the icy water caused screams and tears. However, parents did not make any concessions. A clean face was considered a sign of discipline and good manners. Even in the poorest families, they tried to teach their children this habit, no matter how harsh it was. What if I showed you a medieval wardrobe that was more important than a fortress wall? Clothing was a peasant's main protection against the cold, and the process of getting dressed was an important morning ritual. Of course, there were no wardrobes. Clothes were stored in a simple wooden chest or simply hung on a pole under the roof. After a night in an icy hut, clothes became cold and damp. They absorbed moisture from the air. Putting them on was like wrapping yourself in a wet, icy rag. It was an extremely unpleasant but unavoidable sensation. The wardrobe consisted of two basic items, a coarse linen shirt and a woolen outer garment. The linen wick away moisture from the body, and the wool kept you warm even when wet. It was a simple and effective combination, proven over centuries. The process of getting dressed was multi-layered. First, a linen shirt was put on, which often served as nightwear. Over it was a woolen tunic, or cot. The pants, or bray, were also made of linen, and over them were woolen stockings, which were tied to the belt. Clothes were dirty. They were washed very rarely, especially in winter. Washing in an icy river was hard work, and drying took several days by a smoky hearth. Therefore, clothes were worn for weeks and months until they literally began to stink of dirt and sweat. Smells were an integral part of life. Clothes smelled of smoke, sweat, unwashed bodies, and often livestock. But in conditions of general lack of hygiene, no one paid any attention to this. Footwear was a separate problem. Wooden clogs or simple leather shoes also froze overnight and became stiff. It was not easy to put them on feet already clad in woolen stockings. Often, shoes were stuffed with dry grass for extra warmth. Once dressed, a person was ready to face the day. Their armor of linen and wool was the only thing separating their body from the morning frost. What was your most unpleasant experience of putting on cold clothes? But all this rush was for one purpose. In the next chapter, we will talk about what it was all for, the first meal. The morning meal in the Middle Ages had nothing in common with our breakfast. It was not a time to enjoy food, but merely a necessity to replenish energy reserves before a hard day's work. The table was not particularly varied, especially in winter. Bread was the staple of the diet, but it was not a fluffy loaf, but a heavy, dense loaf made from rye or barley flour. Wheat bread was a privilege of the rich. Peasant bread was sour, coarse, and often as hard as a rock by morning. To eat such bread, it was soaked. Soup or potage was ideal for this. It was a universal medieval soup. In a cauldron which was almost never taken off the fire, porridge made from crushed grain was constantly cooking. Everything in the house went into this cauldron. The base was rye, oats, or barley, dried peas, beans, and, if lucky, root vegetables such as turnips or parsnips were added to them. Meat was a rare guest in such a cauldron. In the morning, water was simply added to the cauldron, and perhaps a handful of fresh grain. The family sat around the hearth, receiving their portion of hot, thick, and bland porridge. They ate from common wooden bowls with wooden spoons. Another important element of the morning was the drink. Raw water was rarely drunk, as people feared its quality. The main drink was ale or weak beer. It was not the intoxicating drink we know today, but rather liquid bread, low in alcohol, cloudy, but high in calories and safe. This meager breakfast was eaten quickly, in silence. People were focused on getting the necessary warmth and calories. Food was fuel, and its taste or appearance was of little importance. It was this hot soup and piece of bread that gave them strength for the first few hours of hard work in the cold. It was simple but vital energy that allowed them to get their bodies going and leave the hut to face a new day. After the fire was lit, the water was brought in, and the first meal was eaten. It was time to prepare for work. This short period in the morning was one of the most important moments of the day. In the dim, flickering light of the hearth, the man would tidy up his tools, on which everything depended: warmth, food, the safety of his family. If a tool failed, the day could be wasted. Therefore, every morning began with a careful inspection, almost like a ritual: checking, sharpening, repairing, adjusting. The dim light of dawn filtered through a small window covered with bubbling ox hide instead of glass. In this scattered twilight, the peasant examined the blade of the axe, running his finger along the edge to feel even the slightest burr. The axe was his main tool, and at the same time, his most valuable possession after the hearth. Without it, it was impossible to gather firewood, repair the fence, or cut down a log for building. Therefore, caring for it was almost a matter of honor. If the blade lost its sharpness, it was sharpened by hand on a wet whetstone. The stone was often old and cracked and was kept by the hearth, where it could be warmed up a little so that it would not crumble in the cold. The man would wet the surface with water, press the axe against the stone, and move it evenly, listening to the grinding echoing off the walls. This sound was a sign of the morning routine, not annoying, but soothing. The axe handle was checked just as carefully. It was made of birch or ash, trees strong enough to withstand repeated blows. But in winter, when the air in the hut was dry and it was freezing outside, the wood dried out and cracked. Sometimes resin or fat was rubbed into the cracks to prevent the wood from crumbling. After all, a broken axe in the forest meant a whole day lost, and sometimes even a risk to life if the person could not quickly return home. In addition to the axe, wedges for splitting wood were also inspected. These simple pieces of iron with a sharpened edge were no less important. If a wedge broke, it could be reforged by the village blacksmith, but this took days or even weeks. Therefore, peasants often had one old spare wedge, even if it was crooked and did not fit well into the wood. Every item was important. Each one was part of their struggle with nature. On the floor near the wall lay wooden pitchforks with long handles, which were used to feed hay to the cattle. Their prongs often broke or bent. The man repaired such things himself, cutting the wood with a knife and reinforcing the cracks with wooden wedges. There were also simple shovels carved out of planks. They were needed to clear the snow at the entrance, because if the threshold was not cleared, the door could simply freeze shut. Even such trifles were of the utmost importance. Working with tools had its own rhythm and mood. The house was silent, with only the crackling of coals and the occasional knock of a hammer. It was still dark outside, and only when the first light of day fell on the wall did the man realize it was time to go out. This moment was almost meditative, preparing the body and spirit for the cold, for hard work. Every blow, every stroke of the whetstone was a step toward the day ahead. At this time, the woman was busy with her own affairs. For her, too, it was time to prepare the tools, only of a different kind. She took out the spindle and spinning wheel, checked to see if the wheel was out of alignment or if the thread had loosened. During the winter months when the fields rested under the snow, spinning became the main occupation. Wool and flax, twisted into threads, were later woven into fabric for clothing, bedding, and sacks. The serviceability of these simple devices was as important as the serviceability of a man's axe. Without thread, it was impossible to sew. Without fabric, it was impossible to insulate the house. Women checked that the thread did not break and that the hook on the spindle did not bend. If necessary, they sharpened the wood with a knife and lubricated the spinning wheel with oil so that the wheel did not squeak. All this was part of the morning ritual, which was imbued with a sense of calm and the experience of generations. This brief morning moment was the last before the start of the day, a pause between the peace of home and the cold world outside. It was a reminder that the life of a peasant depended on small things: a working axe, a sturdy handle, and a woolen cloak. Without these, it was impossible to step outside and face the winter. Each morning knock of the whetstone was a promise. The house was ready, the people were ready, and the day would begin with work as always. Finally, all the morning rituals inside the hut were complete. It was time to go outside. The master of the house approached the heavy wooden door. It had no complicated locks, but was simply closed from the inside with a massive wooden bolt. Opening this door was a physical effort. During the night, it could freeze to the jamb, and it had to be pushed with force with the shoulder. There was a loud creak of frozen wooden hinges, and a stream of frosty air rushed into the hut. The world outside was completely different from the dark, smoky hut. It was gray, quiet, and icy. Dawn barely colored the horizon. The ground beneath their feet was hard as stone and covered with frost or snow. The first steps were cautious. The yard was uneven, covered with frozen mud, debris, and straw. It was easy to slip and fall here, which was especially unpleasant in heavy clothing and with tools. The air was clean and frosty, burning his lungs after the smoky atmosphere of the house. It was a stark change of scenery. The silence was broken only by his own footsteps and perhaps the distant crackling of frozen trees in the forest. The village was just waking up. Thin wisps of smoke were also rising from other huts, a sure sign that the battle for fire had been won there too. But people were not yet out on the streets, each busy with their morning routine. It was a moment of one-on-one confrontation between man and nature. There were no streetlights or cleared paths. There was only him, his tools, and the cold, inhospitable world in which he had to live another day. This first step from the relative safety of home into a hostile environment was a psychologically important moment. It signified the beginning of work, the beginning of the daily struggle. The man took a deep breath of frosty air and headed for his first task. The first task of the morning was aimed at sustaining life, gathering fuel. Without a constant supply of firewood, the fire in the hearth would go out, and the hut would turn into an icy trap. Fire was not just a source of heat, it was the only barrier between life and death. Therefore, as soon as the man opened his eyes and took a sip of yesterday's broth, he immediately grabbed an axe, a rope, and a sled and went out into the yard. The forest awaited him, harsh, silent, but the only source of salvation. Work in the cold began before dawn. The air was so cold that with every breath, His lungs felt as if they were filling with needles. The snow crunched loudly under his boots, breaking the silence of the morning forest. The man walked quickly, trying not to stop because as soon as he slowed down, the cold instantly penetrated his body. The only way to keep warm was to move and work. In those days, warmth was not provided by clothing, but by the person himself, his sweat, effort, and endurance. The winter forest was a dangerous place. Dry trees creaked in the wind, and snow-covered branches could collapse at any moment. But the peasant went there every day, knowing that without this work, neither he nor his family would survive. Chopping frozen wood required superhuman effort. The wood, saturated with moisture and frozen to the core, became harder than stone. The blow of the axe echoed in his ears, as if metal were striking iron. Each blow required strength and precision. A mistake could break the axe, and without it, all work would stop. The axes were cherished like the apple of one's eye, constantly sharpened and greased to prevent the metal from cracking in the cold. Sometimes the wood would not yield, and it was necessary to change the angle of the blow, chopping along the grain until the long-awaited crack finally sounded. It was the sound of victory. The wood had yielded to man. Fingers quickly became numb, even under several layers of wool. The simplest mittens did not protect against the piercing wind. The metal handle of the axe, covered with frost, burned the skin like fire. He had to put down the tool, breathe on his hands, warm them under his armpits, and get back to work. Each breath turned into a thick cloud of steam that instantly settled on his beard, turning it into an icy mask. The forest was silent. Only the blows of the axe, the crack of breaking wood, and his hoarse breathing broke the silence. Sometimes he could hear snow falling from the branches somewhere in the distance, or a frightened bird flying away. Otherwise, there was only cold and hard work. It was slow, exhausting work that did not allow for haste. When the tree finally fell, it had to be cut to pieces and dragged to the sled. Each log weighed dozens of kilograms, and only the force of habit helped the peasant to finish the job. The way back was no easier. The sleigh, loaded with firewood, had to be pulled by hand. Not everyone had horses, and even if they did, not every horse could walk through deep snow. Sometimes it was necessary to clear the way with a shovel and then return to the sleigh. The air became thick and breathing became difficult, but it was impossible to stop. With every passing minute, the sweat on his back turned to ice. While the man was battling the cold in the forest, the woman was not resting. Her morning began not with warmth, but with ice-cold water. She had to go out into the yard, where the animals were waiting in the barn. Even though the frost was so severe that it crackled in the air, she had to take out the manure, cut the hay, and clean the feeders. The barn protected them from the wind, but it did not keep them warm. The steam from the breath of the cattle and the woman mixed, and settling as frost on their hair and clothes. We went through an icy awakening, a battle for fire, washing with ice water, and our first hard work in the cold. The reality of a medieval morning is not a pastoral picture, but a harsh school of survival. Every day began with overcoming the cold, darkness, and one's own discomfort. These people were made of different stuff. Their resilience and ability to endure conditions that seem unimaginable to us command respect. They valued what we take for granted: warmth, light, hot food, and clean water. What other aspects of life in the Middle Ages would you like us to explore? Perhaps how they spent their evenings, what their rare holidays were like, or how they built their homes? Suggest topics for future videos in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you don't miss out on new explorations of the past.